She walked into that reunion telling herself she was fine. She was not fine. 10 years of building something real, a firm, a name, a life, and the moment she stepped through those gilded hotel doors, she was 22 again. Broke. Overlooked. Not enough. They smiled at her the way people smile at someone they've already decided doesn't matter. She should have left. She didn't. And before that night was over, 300 people would watch a man cross an ocean, not for power, not for money, but for the woman they'd spent a decade trying to erase. If this story finds you wherever you are tonight, drop your city in the comments, hit that like button, and let's see how far this one travels. Now stay with me, because this is where it begins. The dress had been hanging on the back of her closet door for 11 days. Zuri Bennett had walked past it every morning without touching it, on her way to the kitchen, on her way back, on her way to work before the sun finished rising over the Atlanta skyline. She'd told herself she was still deciding, that she hadn't committed to anything yet, that she could still call the whole thing off with a simple text message and a reasonable excuse, something about a deadline, a client meeting, a site inspection that couldn't be rescheduled. She'd constructed the excuse in her head at least a dozen times. She never sent it, which meant on the evening of the 14th of October, Zuri Bennett was standing in front of her bathroom mirror in a burgundy cocktail dress that fit her exactly right, pressing her fingertips against her collarbone and breathing through her nose the way her mother had once taught her to breathe before things got hard. In for 4. Hold for 4. Out for 4. Her reflection stared back at her like a stranger. The dress was good. The earrings were good. Her hair was pinned up in a way that had taken 45 minutes and looked like it had taken 10, which was the whole point. She looked by every measurable standard like a woman who had her life together. She felt like a woman about to walk into a burning building. "This is stupid," she said to no one. Her cat, a gray-striped Tom named Brutus, who had the temperament of a disapproving uncle, blinked at her from the edge of the sink and said nothing. "I know," she said. She picked up her clutch, checked her phone. 2 unread emails from her contractor, 1 from her assistant, and a reminder notification that read, "Spellman Hargrove, class of 2014, 10-year reunion, 7 p.m., the Meridian Grand, Buckhead," and walked out of her apartment before she could change her mind again. Totso. The Uber driver was a man in his 50s who had smooth jazz playing at a volume that suggested he was not interested in conversation, which Zuri appreciated deeply. She sat in the back with her clutch in her lap and watched Atlanta slide past the window. The construction cranes lit against the darkening sky, the new mixed-use developments going up along the corridor she'd driven a dozen times this year, the neighborhood she'd watched change and gentrify and argue with themselves about what they were becoming. She'd designed 3 buildings in this city in the last 4 years. 3 buildings that existed in the physical world because she had made them exist, drawn them, fought for them, lost sleep over them, revised them, defended them in front of city planning boards and difficult clients and contractors who thought a young black woman with opinions was an inconvenience to be managed. 3 buildings. She reminded herself of this fact the way a person reminds themselves to breathe when panic starts to close in. It didn't particularly help, because the buildings were real and the reunion was also real, and the problem with reunions was that they had nothing to do with who you'd become. They were about who you'd been, and who you'd been was the raw material other people had used to build their opinion of you. An opinion formed a decade ago and sealed, in many cases, like concrete. Zuri had not been popular at Spellman Hargrove. She'd been smart, which was different. She'd been on scholarship, which was different still. She'd spent 4 years navigating a social landscape that rewarded a specific kind of confidence, the kind that came from money, from legacy, from knowing your family's name meant something in certain rooms. And she had never possessed that kind of confidence. She'd had the other kind, the quieter kind, the kind that kept your head down and your grades up and got you through. It had gotten her through, but getting through and belonging were not the same thing, and she'd spent enough of her adult life untangling that distinction to know it would take more than a nice dress and a successful firm to feel like she had a right to be in that ballroom. The driver pulled up to the Meridian Grand and she tipped him 20% and stepped out into the warm October night. The hotel was everything the name suggested. Marble columns, golden light spilling through tall windows, valets in black uniforms moving with practiced efficiency across the cobblestone entrance. Through the lobby's glass doors, she could already see people gathering, the luminous blur of cocktail attire, the social choreography of people finding their footing in a room full of shared history. She stood on the pavement for 3 seconds. Then she went in. The ballroom was on the second floor, past a curved staircase lined with enormous floral arrangements that smelled aggressively of white lilies. Zuri climbed the stairs at a pace that said, "I'm not nervous," and reached the entrance just as 2 women she vaguely recognized from an elective sociology class were laughing at something on one of their phones. They glanced up, smiled, looked back down. The particular quality of that smile, brief, assessing, quickly withdrawn, told Zuri everything she needed to know about how the next 3 hours were going to feel. She collected a name badge from the registration table, Zuri Bennett, Architecture, and moved into the room. It was louder than she expected, and warmer, and smelled of champagne and expensive cologne, and the particular low-grade anxiety of people performing their best versions of themselves for an audience of people who knew them before the performance began. Round tables were arranged across a parquet floor. A DJ was playing something inoffensive near the far wall. Uplighting turned everything a flattering shade of amber. She found the bar and ordered sparkling water. The bartender was young and efficient and handed it over without comment, which felt like the friendliest interaction she'd had in the last 4 minutes. She turned around, drink in hand, and surveyed the room. There was Marcus Webb, who'd been pre-med and was now apparently a cardiologist in Charlotte. She recognized him from LinkedIn, where he posted inspirational quotes with the regularity of a man who had recently discovered podcasts. He was talking to a woman Zuri didn't recognize. There was Danielle Price, who'd been in her studio art elective sophomore year and now ran a gallery downtown. There was Jerome Ashford, who'd been student body president and carried himself now with the full-body confidence of someone who had never seriously doubted his own importance. And there, at a round table near the center of the room, unmistakable, even a decade later, was Vanessa Whitmore. Zuri's stomach contracted. It was involuntary, visceral. The physical memory of 100 small wounds activating at once, like scar tissue responding to pressure. Vanessa was wearing white, which was a choice that announced itself. She was seated with a group of 4 or 5 others, her posture perfect, her laugh timed with the precision of a woman who had spent her whole life understanding exactly how she appeared to the people around her. She'd been beautiful at 22, and she was beautiful at 32, which felt, Zuri recognized this as irrational and felt it anyway, deeply unfair. She turned away from Vanessa's table. She was going to get through this. She'd stay 2 hours, speak to enough people to make it worth having come, and leave with her dignity intact. That was the plan. It was a reasonable plan. Zuri Bennett. She turned. Vanessa Whitmore was standing 4 feet away from her, champagne flute in hand, with the same smile she'd worn at every event in college, wide, warm, and constructed to withhold something. "I almost didn't recognize you," Vanessa said. "Vanessa," Zuri said, "you look well. You too." Vanessa's eyes moved over her in a single efficient pass, cataloging the dress, the earrings, the hair, the absence of a ring. "I heard you started your own firm. That's impressive." "Thanks." "It must be hard," Vanessa said. "Running everything yourself. No partners?" There it was, fast, efficient. The question calibrated precisely to land on the bruise. "I have a team," Zuri said. 12 people. "Oh, I mean business partners." A slight pause. "Or otherwise." Zuri held the woman's gaze and said nothing. Vanessa's smile didn't falter. "My husband has a firm out of Midtown. Commercial real estate. You two would probably have a lot to talk about if he weren't always traveling." She let the word husband breathe for a second. "How's your personal life going? I feel like I never see you posting about anything. Anything good, I mean." "It's good," Zuri said. "That's great." Vanessa touched her arm, a gesture that looked like warmth and felt like a thumb pressing on a nerve. "You know, I always admired how focused you were in school, so dedicated, never distracted by, you know." She glanced meaningfully at the diamond on her left hand. "Other things." Zuri smiled. Her face was doing exactly what she needed it to do. Her chest was doing something else entirely. "Good to see you, Vanessa," she said, and moved away. Matt. She found a quieter corner near the windows and spent 15 minutes doing the thing that had gotten her through uncomfortable situations her entire adult life. She looked at the architecture. The Meridian Grand's ballroom was a 1940s original, renovated badly in the 90s and then renovated again, properly, sometime in the last decade. She could see the bones beneath the restoration. The coffered ceiling with its original plasterwork, carefully preserved. The pilasters running the perimeter, not load-bearing but placed with an understanding of proportion that was either instinctive or learned. The floor-to-ceiling windows on the east wall, single pane in the original structure, updated to double-glazed but matched to period specifications. Somebody had cared about this room. Somebody had understood that you restore a space by listening to it, not overwriting it. She was still looking at the ceiling when someone stopped next to her. "Still doing that," said a voice. She looked down from the ceiling. Ethan Caldwell was standing beside her with a glass of bourbon and the particular expression of a man who was aware he owed a debt and hadn't decided yet whether to pay it. He was good-looking in exactly the way he'd been at 22, which was to say conventionally, inoffensively, with the kind of face that photographed well and revealed very little. He'd filled out since college, wore a better suit. The confidence was there, but there was something around his eyes, a slight dulling. The look of someone who'd had to revise a version of himself he'd been very attached to. "The ceiling thing," he said. "You were always looking at the ceiling." "Ethan," she said. "Hey, Zuri." He said it softly, like they were resuming a conversation that had never actually ended. She didn't say anything. "You look," he started. "Don't," she said. He stopped. She turned back to the window. Outside, Atlanta's skyline burned orange and gold in the early evening, the buildings she knew by name stacked against the darkening sky. "I wanted to reach out," he said. "After graduation, I thought about Ethan." She kept her voice flat. "Even." The voice she used in client meetings when someone said something that required correction without confrontation. "Whatever you've been meaning to say for 10 years, tonight isn't the night." A pause. "Okay," he said. "Good." He didn't leave immediately, which she'd counted on him doing. He stood there another few seconds with his bourbon, and she felt the awkward weight of it, the history of a specific kind of hurt that had no name precise enough for the occasion. He'd been her first real relationship in college. Not a fling, not a situationship, but something that had felt like the beginning of a life. And then Vanessa's crowd had taken an interest in him, had offered him something Zuri couldn't: access, visibility, a social position he'd apparently decided he needed more than he needed her. And he had, quietly and without drama, removed himself from her life. He'd done it so gently she'd almost been confused about whether it had happened at all. He moved away eventually. She exhaled. Around her the party swelled, the noise thickening, the conversations overlapping. She smiled at people she half knew and answered questions about her firm and her neighborhood and whether she'd been back to campus recently. She listened to a man named Derek go on for 6 minutes about his startup without asking her a single question. She accepted a champagne flute she didn't want because refusing it felt like work. By 9 o'clock, she was tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep deprivation. It was the tiredness of performing normalcy in a room that kept reminding her, in small and medium and occasionally large ways, that she'd never quite fit the mold it was casting from. She was heading toward the restrooms when she heard it. Vanessa's voice. Not directed at her, directed at the table, at the laughing group gathered there, but pitched at a volume that was either careless or deliberate. "I mean, it's impressive she built something. I'm just saying, at some point you have to wonder what she's actually working toward. Like, the firm, okay. But then what? She's 32, she's alone, she's never..." Zuri kept walking. Through the corridor, past the floral arrangements, into the marble-tiled restroom where the lighting was flattering and the music was muffled and she could lean both hands on the edge of the vanity and look at herself without anyone watching. She looked at herself for a long time. Her eyes were dry. She'd decided years ago that she was done crying over Vanessa Whitmore. That decision held, but her hands were pressing hard against the cold marble edge, and her jaw was tight, and the face looking back at her was the face of a woman who was very, very tired. She took a breath. Let it out. She was not going to fall apart in a hotel bathroom over a woman she hadn't spoken to in a decade. She was going to wash her hands, straighten her dress, and walk back out there because she had built something. Something real, something that existed in the physical world, and would continue existing long after this ballroom dissolved back into whatever it had been before. She ran cold water over her wrists. She dried her hands. She walked back out. She heard it before she understood it. The ballroom had changed register. The music had stopped. Not faded, stopped, cut at mid-beat. And the conversation had collapsed from 100 separate threads into a single communal silence that pressed against the eardrums like a change in altitude. Then the sound of footsteps in the corridor, multiple sets, deliberate and coordinated, and beneath that a lower frequency. The sense of something large and organized moving toward the room. They came through the main entrance in a formation so smooth it looked choreographed. 6 men first, tall, suited, faces arranged in the specific kind of watchful neutrality that was itself a kind of statement. They moved to positions around the perimeter of the room with practiced efficiency, and the crowd shifted back from them involuntarily, the social geometry rearranging itself around a new center of gravity. Then he walked in. He wasn't the tallest man in the room. He wasn't physically imposing in the way that word usually implies. But there was something about the way he occupied space, a quality of absolute stillness within movement, like a current beneath still water, that made every person in the ballroom acutely aware of exactly where he was standing. He was Korean, perhaps mid-30s, dressed in a charcoal suit of a cut that was either very expensive or very European, or both. His face was still, not unexpressive, but controlled in the manner of a man who had spent a long time deciding which things were worth showing. He walked like someone who had never in his life been rushed by another person's timetable. Zuri watched him enter from her position near the far wall, and she thought with the practical portion of her mind that was always functioning. Someone rented out a second ballroom tonight, and the overflow just arrived at the wrong party. She watched a city councilman she recognized step forward with an outstretched hand and a high-wattage smile. The man in the charcoal suit looked at him briefly, nodded, did not shake the hand, kept walking. The councilman's smile held for a half-second too long before collapsing. Around the room, she watched the social calculus happening in real time. Eyes flickering to phones, recognition crossing faces, whispered exchanges. Whatever this man was, people were figuring it out fast, and the figuring out was producing expressions that ranged from avid interest to careful recalibration to something closer to nervous deference. Kang Min-jae. She didn't know the name yet. She would learn it shortly from the whispered reaction of a woman standing 2 feet to her left. That's Kang Min-jae, I think, the one Garrett's firm tried to get a meeting with for 6 months. But she didn't know the name yet. What she knew, in the seconds before the name attached itself to the face, was that this man had entered a room full of people competing for status and power and social position, and he had rendered the competition irrelevant simply by existing within it. And then he was looking at her. She noticed it the moment his gaze moved past the councilman and the assembled important people and landed, settled, on her face. There was a pause in his motion, brief, almost imperceptible. He started walking again, toward her. Zuri looked behind herself, the way a person does when they're certain the attention can't be for them. There was a window, a wall. She looked back. He was still coming. The crowd parted ahead of him without appearing to decide to do it. He moved through the room like water through a gap, unhurried, his eyes not leaving her face, and she felt the specific and disorienting sensation of being seen by someone who was looking at her, and only her, in a room full of 300 people who had spent most of the night looking through her. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see the detail of him, the slight shadow beneath his jaw, the quality of attention in his eyes, which were dark and very still and completely focused. He reached out, and his hand settled at her waist. Light, certain, and in a voice pitched low enough for her and the immediate silence around her to receive, he said, "There you are, Jagia." The room did not breathe. Zuri Bennett looked at this man, this stranger, this man she was completely certain she had never met, and felt the floor shift beneath her. Because his eyes, as they held hers, carried something she hadn't expected. Not possession, not performance. Recognition, the kind that didn't need an explanation, the kind that arrived before language, the kind that made no sense and landed in the chest with the weight of something true. She opened her mouth. She did not speak. And in the suspended stillness of a ballroom that had forgotten how to exhale, Zuri Bennett stood in front of a man who claimed to know her and found, somewhere beneath the confusion and the shock and the accumulated weight of a terrible night, a single thought surfacing like something recovered from deep water. His eyes. I've seen his eyes before. She just couldn't remember where. The hand at her waist did not move. That was the first thing Zuri registered. Not the silence, not the 300 people watching, not the cold shock of being touched by a stranger in the middle of a room full of people she'd been trying to survive all night. It was the fact that his hand stayed exactly where it had settled, with a steadiness that wasn't possessive but wasn't uncertain either. Like he'd placed it there and decided it belonged there and was prepared to wait for the rest of the world to catch up. She looked at him. He looked at her. I don't know you, she said, low, careful. The voice she used when she was very close to the edge of something and needed to stay on the right side of it. You do, he said, equally low. No argument in it, just the flat declaration of a man who dealt in facts. I've never met you. You have. His hand didn't move. Seoul? November. Last year. Something shifted in her chest. Not recognition, not yet, but the precursor to it. The feeling of a word on the tip of the tongue. A shape without a name. She was still working through it when she became aware, in the specific way that you become aware of a fire that's been burning quietly in a room you just walked back into, that the entire ballroom was watching them. Not glancing, watching. The focused, unblinking attention of 300 people who had collectively decided that whatever was happening between this woman and this man was the only thing worth looking at in the room. Zuri straightened. Take your hand off me, she said. A beat. He removed his hand. Clean and immediate. No protest. He stepped back 1/2 step, enough to give her the geometry of her own space, not enough to suggest retreat. I apologize, he said. I should have led differently. You should have introduced yourself. Yes. She waited. Kang Min Jae, he said. The name landed in the room like a stone into still water. She felt the ripple of it through the crowd behind her without turning around. The intake of breath, the whispered repetitions, the social seismograph of people recalibrating their understanding of what they were witnessing. The name meant nothing to her, immediately. Then the woman who'd whispered it earlier was suddenly crowding the edge of her consciousness. Garrett's firm, 6 months, couldn't get a meeting, and she began to understand in rough outline what the room was telling her. Is that supposed to mean something to me? She said. Something crossed his face, not offense. Something closer to, she would think about this later, relief. No, he said. I don't imagine it does. No. Someone found them a table. Zuri wasn't sure how it happened. One of the suited men materialized with the quiet efficiency of someone who solved problems before they fully formed, and then there were 2 chairs at a small table near the window, away from the loudest part of the crowd, with a bottle of still water and 2 glasses and a subtle but absolute boundary of cleared space around them that communicated, without anyone saying so, that other people were not to approach. She sat because standing in the middle of that room with everyone watching felt worse than sitting. He sat across from her. The suited men redistributed themselves to the perimeter. The room around them slowly, reluctantly, began to resume its own activity. Music restarting at a lower volume, conversations re-engaging, the social organism reorganizing itself around the new reality. Zuri put both hands flat on the table. Talk, she said. He reached for the water, poured her glass first, then his own, with the unhurried precision of someone who didn't recognize urgency as a category that applied to him. November of last year, he said. You were in Seoul. I go to Seoul for work sometimes. I know. You were there for a site consultation on a mixed-use development near Mapo-gu. You stayed 12 days. Her hands went still on the table. Yes, she said slowly. That's right. On the 9th night it rained. You left your hotel after 10 o'clock. You walked 4 blocks to a convenience store that had already closed. He looked at her directly. You didn't know it was closed until you got there. You stood under the awning trying to figure out what to do. The image came back to her fragmented, the way a dream comes back. in texture rather than sequence. Rain, cold, the particular yellow light of a closed storefront glowing uselessly against the wet street. The frustration of being hungry and tired and in a city where she didn't speak enough of the language to know how to solve the problem quickly. And a figure already at the awning, already sitting on the low concrete step, looking at her like she'd arrived somewhere he'd been waiting without knowing he was waiting. "You had an umbrella," he said. "It was... I had..." She stopped. "You were already there." "I was already there." She looked at him, really looked at him, the way she hadn't allowed herself to look before, because she'd been too busy managing the shock of his entrance and the audience and the hand at her waist. She tried to locate the memory in his face. It was the problem of context. A face encountered in one set of circumstances filed away in the brain under conditions that no longer applied. She'd been tired. It had been raining. She'd been thinking about the consultation documents she still needed to revise. But something in the eyes. "You were in different clothes," she said. "Yes." "You looked..." She paused. "Different." "I know how I looked," he said. There was something in his voice when he said it. Not shame, but its aftermath. The flat, factual acknowledgement of a man who had arrived at a difficult truth through experience rather than reflection. She pressed her fingertips harder against the table. "You bought me tea," she said, the memory assembling now, piece by piece. "From your bag, you had a thermos, convenience store thermos from earlier. And I had my coffee from your hotel. You'd brought it. You gave it to me." She had. She remembered now the specific absurdity of offering a stranger her lukewarm hotel coffee in the rain, the way he'd taken it with both hands, which she'd registered at the time as a kind of politeness she found unexpectedly touching. "We talked," she said. 40 minutes, he said. "Approximately." "You didn't tell me your name." "No." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. The water sat between them, untouched. Around them, the party continued its reconstruction, but it was a different party now, happening at a distance. "I wasn't certain I wanted to be found," he said. There was a simplicity to the statement that she hadn't expected. She'd anticipated something managed, an explanation crafted to land correctly. What she got instead felt closer to the thing itself. "Found," she repeated. "I spent a long time making myself someone that people look for," he said, "for the wrong reasons." She wanted to press on that. She wanted to ask the specific and particular question that was forming at the back of her throat about why he was here, now, in her alumni ballroom in Buckhead, 10 months after a 40-minute conversation in the rain outside a closed convenience store in Seoul. But she was aware, sharply, uncomfortably aware, of the fact that they were still in a room full of people, people who were watching, people who were going to have opinions. She looked past his shoulder. Vanessa Whitmore was staring at them, not with the performance of casual interest, with the open, calculating attention of someone actively processing information and considering how to use it. Her head was tilted, her champagne flute had stopped halfway to her mouth. The social mask was still in place, but something behind it was moving fast. Zuri looked back at Min-jae. "You could have called," she said. "I did call." She opened her mouth. 11 times, he said, "between December and February. International number. You didn't answer." She closed her eyes for 2 seconds. She received approximately 400 phone calls a month. Half were contractors. A third were clients. The remainder were everything else, which included numbers she didn't recognize from area codes she didn't have logged. And she had a policy, a reasonable, rational, professionally necessary policy, of not answering numbers she didn't recognize until they left a voicemail explaining themselves. "You didn't leave messages," she said. "No." "Why?" He looked at her. "What would I have said?" She didn't have an answer for that. She wasn't sure there was one. "Zuri?" She heard her name from a different direction and turned. Ethan Caldwell was standing 4 feet away with his bourbon and a new expression she hadn't seen from him before. Harder, less controlled, the particular look of a man confronting something he hadn't factored into his evening. His eyes moved between her and Min-jae, back to her. "You know this guy?" he said. "Ethan. Because that's..." He lowered his voice, though not enough. "You know who that is?" I'm figuring it out, she said. Zuri. His voice was sharp with something she hadn't heard from Ethan in 10 years. Urgency, maybe, or something that wanted to look like concern. He's not. This isn't Ethan. She stood up from the table, slow, deliberate, looked at him until he stopped speaking. I will be talking to you never. Please walk away. His jaw tightened. He looked at Min Jae, who had not turned around, who was sitting with the complete stillness of a man who understood that there were fights worth entering and fights worth leaving to resolve themselves. Then he looked back at Zuri with an expression that had too many things in it. Concern, yes, but also something older and less clean. And he walked away. She sat back down. Her hands were not shaking. She noted this with something close to satisfaction. Ex-boyfriend, she said. It wasn't a question. It was apparent, Min Jae said. He's not, she exhaled. It was college. It doesn't matter. It matters to him. She looked at him directly. He was watching her with the same focused attention he'd brought through the door, the same quality of being completely present in a way that was disarming precisely because it was so rare. Why are you here, she said. Not soul, here. This specific room. I looked for you, he said. When the calls didn't reach you, I used other means. What means? Your name was on a coffee cup receipt at the cafe near the hotel, he said. Surname only. It took time to narrow. She stopped. You tracked me down from a coffee cup receipt. And your architecture firm, he said. When I found the name, the firm came quickly, and then a LinkedIn post from the week before this event, a comment from a classmate, a public RSVP, Patat. Stop! She pressed one hand against her forehead. Stop right there. She was quiet for a moment. In the background, the music had settled into something with a slow, indifferent beat. Someone laughed too loudly at the bar. That is an extraordinary amount of effort, she said. Yes, he said. No apology in it. Most people would call that. I know what most people would call it, he said. I called it many things myself over the last 10 months. She looked at him. You're telling me, she said carefully, that you, a man with that many people who just watched you enter a room, spent 10 months looking for a woman you talked to for 40 minutes in the rain. Yes. Over a coffee and a thermos of convenience store tea. It wasn't about the coffee, he said. She sat with that, the honest answer to the question in her chest, the one that was assembling itself from the fragments of that night in Seoul, from the quality of the memory now that it was returning properly, from the specific way this man had looked at her across a ballroom like she was the only fixed point in it, was that she understood what he meant. She didn't want to understand it, because it was inconvenient and strange, and her entire nervous system was running on the thready energy of a woman who had already been pushed to several limits tonight. But she understood what he meant, because she had thought about that night too, not in a way that crystallized into anything she'd named, but in the way a thing sits in you without announcing itself, showing up in the background of other thoughts, in the particular feeling of walking through a rainy evening somewhere, in the absence of something that she'd written off as circumstance. She hadn't known what she was missing. She just knew something had been missing. I need a minute, she said. She stood up again and walked toward the windows and looked at Atlanta burning amber and gold beneath the October sky, her arms folded across her chest, her mind doing several things at once, and none of them in sequence. She didn't get the minute. Well, said a voice at her elbow, this is unexpected. Vanessa Whitmore materialized beside her with the smooth inevitability of a woman who had spent her entire life moving toward the center of things. Her champagne was fresh. Her smile was at full operational capacity. Her eyes were doing the fast and efficient work of someone who has just identified an opportunity and is calculating the approach. I didn't know you knew Kang Min Jae, she said. I don't think it's your business, Zuri said. No, of course. A small, accommodating wave of one hand. I'm surprised. Pleasantly. She paused. He's remarkable, isn't he? I heard he acquired 3 banks in 6 months last spring, and the infrastructure deal in the Philippines, Vanessa. And Marcus was just saying that his venture arm turned down a $30 million proposal from one of the city council's pet projects without even reviewing the second pitch. Vanessa. Zuri turned to look at her fully. What do you want? The performance shifted slightly. Not dropped, recalibrated. The smile became something more direct. Harrison is working on something, Vanessa said. Her husband's name. A medical development project. He's been trying to get in front of the right investors for 14 months. This is Kangmin Jae's firm is exactly the kind of partner he needs. So talk to him, Zuri said. He doesn't take meetings through conventional channels. Everyone who's tried has a slight pause. You could introduce us. There it was. The full, complete architecture of the conversation. Every comment tonight, every sharp smile, every calibrated question about Zuri's personal life and career and unmarried status laid bare in a single request. Not cruelty for cruelty's sake. Cruelty as currency. Vanessa Whitmore had been doing exactly what she'd always done, establishing hierarchy so she'd have something to spend when she needed it. And now she needed something. The particular satisfaction of watching a plan expose itself was almost worth what had preceded it. No, Zuri said. Vanessa's smile held. Zuri. No. Clean. Final. I won't do that. A pause. The smile recalibrated again. Something colder coming to the surface. Something that had always been there beneath the champagne and the polished delivery. We've known each other a long time, Vanessa said. We've been aware of each other a long time, Zuri said. That's not the same thing. Vanessa looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone deciding how much of themselves to reveal. Then she set her champagne down on a nearby surface and turned back to face Zuri directly. You've always been like this, she said. Quieter now. The performance gone. You know that? Even in school. Someone extends a hand and you look at it like it's a trap. Your hands have always been traps, Zuri said. A silence. That's not fair, Vanessa said. Isn't it? It wasn't a question. She delivered it flat and watched Vanessa absorb it and felt something she hadn't expected. Not triumph, but fatigue. The deep cellular exhaustion of someone who had been defending the same ground for a decade and was only now beginning to understand that the ground had never been worth defending over. I need to get back, Zuri said. She turned and walked back toward the table. Min-jae was standing when she returned. He'd been watching, not the exchange with Vanessa, which had been too far and too quiet, but the room, the way it moved, the social weather of the space. He watched the way she crossed the floor. She could feel it. She sat down. He sat. Someone you know, he said. Someone I went to school with, she said. It's different. He accepted this without further inquiry, which she found, in that particular moment, more considerate than anything the evening had offered her so far. I need to ask you something, she said. Ask. That night in Seoul. She looked at him directly. You said you weren't sure you wanted to be found. What did that mean? The stillness that had characterized him all evening intensified slightly. Not discomfort, the deliberate pause of someone choosing how much truth to use. I was in a difficult period, he said. How difficult? People I'd trusted had a pause. Made decisions that cost me a great deal. Professionally? He looked at her. Among other things. She heard what wasn't being said. She'd spent her professional life learning to read the structural implications of what wasn't in a blueprint, the stresses that showed up in behavior rather than design. The man sitting across from her had arrived at that rainy storefront from somewhere much darker than a bad business quarter. You were alone, she said. He was quiet for a moment. I'd forgotten, he said carefully, what it felt like to have a conversation with someone who didn't want anything from me. The sentence landed in her chest with a weight she hadn't prepared for. She thought about the 40 minutes in the rain. She hadn't known who he was, had no reason to treat him as anything other than a man caught outside a closed shop in the cold. So she hadn't. She'd talked to him the way she talked to anyone, directly, without performance. She'd complained about the rain and asked him what he did and laughed at something he said that was quietly funny, and eventually they'd walk together back toward the hotel district until their paths diverged. She'd thought about him after, not as a person she'd expected to see again, more the way you think about a good song that comes on unexpectedly, present for a moment, then past, but leaving something behind. I thought about that night, she said. She said it before she decided to. Not, I didn't know who you were or think I'd... She stopped, organized herself. I just thought about it. He looked at her. So did I, he said. For 10 months. The room around them continued its indifferent motion. The DJ had moved into something with a slower tempo. At the bar, a small crowd had gathered. Somewhere behind Zuri, she could hear Vanessa's voice, a different frequency now, sharper, lower, speaking to someone. She didn't turn around. I don't know what you're expecting from tonight, she said. I'm not expecting anything, he said. I came because I didn't know what I'd do if I didn't try. She held that. And if I'd told you to leave 20 minutes ago? Then I would have left, he said. 20 minutes ago. She studied him. The honesty of it, the uncomplicated plainness of the answer, sat against every interaction she'd had in the last 3 hours like something from a different category. She was on the edge of saying something, she wasn't sure what, when the sound behind her shifted, not louder. Wrong. The specific quality of a social situation deteriorating, the change in register that precedes a scene. She turned. Vanessa Whitmore was standing 6 feet away, not looking at Zuri, looking at Minjae, with the focused energy of a woman who had made a decision and committed to it past the point of comfortable reversal. And beside her, a man Zuri didn't immediately recognize. Harrison, she realized, Vanessa's husband, red-cheeked and taut, with the specific tension of a man who'd been briefed too quickly and sent into a situation he wasn't prepared for. Mr. Kang, Vanessa said, warm, professional. The full performance reloaded and operating at peak power. I apologize for interrupting. I'm Vanessa Whitmore. I believe you may know my husband's firm, Whitmore Medical Development Partners. We submitted a proposal to your acquisitions team earlier this year regarding the Harwell Medical Complex project in... Minjae looked at Vanessa Whitmore the way a person looks at a door that is opened onto a room they didn't ask to enter. Not hostile, not warm. A complete, efficient absence of surprise, as though the interruption had been catalogued and filed before it finished arriving. Mrs. Whitmore, he said. The use of her name stopped her. A flicker crossed her face. Recalibration, fast, before the smile reseated itself. You know me? She said. I know your husband's proposal, he said. I reviewed it personally. Harrison Whitmore, standing half a step behind his wife, reacted to this the way a man reacts to an unexpected piece of good news. A visible loosening through the shoulders, a brightness in the eyes that had no business being there yet. Then you understand the scope of what we're proposing, Harrison said, moving forward. He had the voice of a man who'd done a lot of conference room pitching, modulated, persuasive, calibrated to read as both confident and deferential. The Harwell complex is a 14-block medical corridor. The infrastructure component alone represents, I know what it represents, Minjae said. I declined it. The brightness went out of Harrison's eyes. The review process, Harrison started, is complete, Minjae said. The decision was made this morning. The silence that followed was of a very specific quality. Zuri had been in enough client meetings to recognize it. The silence of a number being named that nobody in the room had expected, landing on the table like a piece of equipment too heavy for the surface. Vanessa's smile had not moved. This was, Zuri thought, the most disturbing part. The smile that stayed in place while everything behind it reorganized at speed. I see, Vanessa said. Even, controlled. May I ask the basis for the decision? Structural liability in the Phase 2 financing model, Minjae said, and a due diligence gap in the environmental impact assessment for the eastern parcels. He paused. And the lead architect of record listed on the proposal hasn't completed a project of comparable scale. Harrison Whitmore's jaw tightened. His left hand, hanging at his side, made a slow fist. We can address those concerns, he said. If there's an opportunity for a second conversation, there isn't, Minjae said. No heat in it, no edge, just the flat topography of a door being closed. Vanessa's smile finally moved. Not disappeared, contracted, pulling inward, becoming something smaller and more precise. She turned her eyes to Zuri, and what Zuri saw in them was not humiliation, which she might have expected. It was something older and more dangerous. The look of a woman who had just been handed a loss in public and was already constructing the terms of her response. Well, Vanessa said, I suppose some relationships open doors. The room caught that. The cluster of people near enough to hear, and there were more than a few, because the social acoustics of a ballroom are merciless, absorbed it, processed it, and looked at Zuri with expressions ranging from discomfort to poorly concealed satisfaction. The implication was clean and specific, that whatever Zuri had in the room tonight had been borrowed, that the attention of the man across from her was a resource Zuri had somehow obtained through circumstance rather than earned through anything real. Zuri looked at Vanessa. For 10 years she had answered this woman with restraint, with dignified silence, with the measured, controlled response of someone who had decided that engagement was beneath her and retreat was the wiser position. For 10 years she had left the room, swallowed the words, held the straight line of her own composure against the pressure of 100 small cruelties, because she'd told herself that was the choice that preserved her. She was very, very tired of that choice. Some relationships, Zuri said, are built by people who led with something worth having. Vanessa's eyes sharpened. And some people, Zuri continued, her voice steady and completely without performance, spend 10 years mistaking cruelty for power and wondering why neither one of them sticks. The space around them had gone quiet in the particular way of an audience that has just understood that what it is watching is real. Vanessa Whitmore stood in the amber light of the ballroom in her white dress with her empty champagne flute and looked at Zuri Bennett with the expression of a woman encountering, for the first time in a very long time, something she had not engineered. Harrison touched her arm. Light, urgent. She let him steer her away. Zuri turned back to the table. Her heart was going at a pace she could feel in her throat. Her hands were steady. These two facts existed simultaneously, and she accepted both of them. Min-jae was watching her. That needed to happen, she said, less to him than to herself. Yes, he said, simply. She sat down. Ikem. The next 20 minutes were quieter. The party had restructured itself around them, not avoiding exactly, but maintaining a respectful distance, the social equivalent of yielding a lane. People glanced over. A few pointed discreetly in the way people point when they believe they're being subtle and aren't. Zuri drank her water and answered Min-jae's questions. Because he asked them careful and specific questions about her firm, about the projects she was most proud of, about what it meant to design a building that had to exist inside a city rather than just on top of it. And she found somewhere in the 32nd minute of this that she had stopped performing. That was the thing she noticed. She wasn't monitoring her expression. She wasn't calculating what she said against what impression it might leave. She was just talking. The way she talked when she was alone with something she cared about. The way she talked to a stranger outside a closed convenience store in Seoul in the rain. She asked him questions back. He answered them, not completely, not without the occasional deliberate pause where she could feel him selecting which truth to use, but genuinely. He told her about the company, about the infrastructure investments that had taken him from Seoul to Manila to Lisbon in the last 2 years. He described a development project in Busan, a reclamation of industrial waterfront into mixed public space, with the precision of someone who had studied it and found in it the same thing she found in her own work, the profound and sometimes terrifying fact that what you build will outlast you. She had not expected that. The specificity of his interest in the built environment, the way he understood a city not as a backdrop, but as a system of choices made by people who had to live inside the consequences of those choices. You didn't study architecture, she said. Engineering, he said. Originally, before other things. What other things? He looked at her with a slight adjustment in his expression. Not evasion, exactly. Acknowledgement that the answer to that question was long and had a shape he wasn't going to hand over in one piece. The kind of things that take longer to explain than one evening allows, he said. She accepted that. Not because she wasn't curious, she was, with the focused curiosity of someone who had just been handed a corner piece and could see that the puzzle was much larger than the box suggested, but because she understood, in some animal way she didn't need to articulate, that they were not at the end of this conversation. They were somewhere near the beginning. That thought arrived in her chest, and she let it sit there, turned it over without deciding what it meant, and put it somewhere accessible for later. She didn't see Ethan come back. That was her first mistake of the evening. Not the fight with Vanessa, not the table by the window, not any of the choices that had preceded this moment. The moment when she looked up from a conversation that had made her briefly forget where she was and saw Ethan Caldwell standing 6 feet away with his third or fourth bourbon and the expression of a man who had spent the last 40 minutes convincing himself he was doing the right thing. Behind him, two men she didn't recognize, not suited like Min-jae's people. Different. City business clothes, the look of men who had been found at the party rather than brought to it. She felt Min-jae register it before she fully processed what she was seeing, a shift in his posture. Nothing visible to anyone not paying close attention, just a slight resettlement of weight, a stillness that went a degree deeper. One of Min-jae's men materialized at the edge of the table, a murmured exchange in Korean that Zuri couldn't follow. Min-jae's expression didn't change. "What is this?" Zuri said. "A conversation I should take outside," Min-jae said. He was already standing, smoothly, without urgency, the way a man stands when he's decided that urgency will cost him more than steadiness. "Min-jae, stay here." He said it quietly, not a command, a request, with the particular quality of a request that comes from someone who is accustomed to the possibility that it might be refused and is asking anyway. She stayed. She watched him move across the floor toward Ethan and the two men, his two suited security personnel flanking at a distance that managed to be both visible and non-escalatory. She watched the exchange, brief, low, the body language of Ethan doing most of the talking, and Min-jae doing almost none of it, which told her everything about who held the structural advantage. Then Ethan said something, and Min-jae went very still. Not the controlled stillness she'd been watching all evening. Something different. Something that happened in the space of one breath and resolved before the next. Then he turned and walked back toward her. Ethan and the two men watched him go. The two men exchanged something. Ethan put his empty glass on a passing tray and looked at the floor. Min-jae sat back down. "What was that?" Zuri said. "Nothing that concerns tonight," he said. "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. She looked at him directly. He met it. "Someone from your organization?" she said. A pause. "Someone who was," he said. She heard the tense, filed it. "Are you in danger?" she said. Flat, direct, not a performance of concern. The actual question. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read, which was itself an answer of a kind. Something moved through his eyes, not fear, nothing that simple, but the shadow of something that had been fear once and had since been converted into something harder and more operational. "Not tonight," he said. "Min-jae." "Not tonight," he said again. "I promise you that." She held his gaze for another 3 seconds. Then she looked away, toward the window, toward Atlanta's skyline, toward the physical world she understood better than the one she'd been navigating for the last 90 minutes. "You have complicated enemies," she said. "I have complicated everything," he said. For the first time since he'd walked through the door, she heard something in his voice that wasn't controlled. Not much. A thread, thin as wire, running beneath the surface of the sentence. Tiredness. The specific tiredness of someone who has been managing the consequences of their own choices for a very long time, and is aware that the management will never fully end. She thought about soul. The step outside the closed storefront, the specific quality of a person sitting alone in the rain, who looked like he'd been alone for much longer than the rain. "Tell me what happened," she said. "Before soul. What you meant when you said people you trusted made decisions." He was quiet. "You don't have to," she said. "No," he said. He stopped, started differently. "There were men inside my organization who decided their interests were better served by different leadership." "A coup," she said. He looked at her. "That's the word." "Did they succeed?" "Temporarily," he said. She waited. "I spent 4 months rebuilding from outside what I'd spent 12 years building from inside," he said. "It required a particular kind of..." A pause. "Focus." "Is it finished?" The look he gave her was the look of a man who understood that some things don't finish. They become part of the landscape. "Largely," he said. "And the men?" "Addressed," he said. She didn't ask what that meant. The shape of it was clear enough in the way he said it. Not with satisfaction, not with residual anger, but with the flat factual weight of something that had needed doing and had been done. This was the moment, she understood, where a different kind of woman would have pulled back, made the calculation that the complications outweighed the evening, constructed a graceful exit, and taken it. She understood this about herself. She was not that woman. She'd spent her career in rooms full of complicated men with complicated priorities who made complicated decisions and called the consequences of those decisions somebody else's problem. She was not naive about what the shape of Min Jae's world looked like from a distance. But she was also sitting across from someone who had flown 13 hours, who had spent 10 months following a thread that began with a coffee cup receipt, who had arrived at her alumni reunion in Buckhead, Atlanta, and walked past a city councilman and 300 competing priorities to stop in front of her specifically. Not because of her firm, not because of her name, not because of any advantage she represented, because of 40 minutes in the rain. She was still working out what to do with all of this when Vanessa Whitmore's voice cut through the room, loud this time, loud enough to be heard across the ambient noise of the party, loud in the particular way of a woman who has stopped calculating and started burning. Think people should know exactly what kind of man they're sharing a room with tonight. Zuri turned. Zuri. Vanessa was standing near the center of the room, not at her table, not at the bar, but in the open space where the sightlines were clearest and the acoustics were most unforgiving. Harrison was 2 steps behind her with an expression of a man watching a decision happen that he can no longer stop. Around her, the party had gone quiet by degrees, conversations dropping off as proximity to the sound created attention, and attention created the silence that Vanessa Whitmore had, deliberately or instinctively, been engineering. His company, she said. Her voice had the carrying quality of practiced projection. Kang Min Jae's company. You should ask where the infrastructure capital actually comes from. You should ask about Macau. You should ask about what happened to 3 of his senior partners in the last 18 months. The room had fully stopped now. Every face was turned. Zuri felt the shift in the space beside her before she heard it. Min Jae standing, the quiet, controlled movement of a man who had decided, in the span of one breath, that the management of this particular situation required his presence in a different part of the room. His security moved with him. Vanessa watched him approach with the expression of a woman who has lit something and is only now beginning to calculate what it will consume. He stopped in front of her at a distance that was not threatening and was not retreating and was not anything other than exactly what it was. A man giving a woman who'd just made a very significant error the full and complete attention of his regard. The room held its breath. Vanessa's chin was up. Her composure was still assembled, but it had the quality of something built too fast from inadequate materials. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, quiet, carrying anyway, in the silence, to every corner of the room. The people in this room deserve to know. They deserve, he said, to know that your husband's proposal was declined this morning on the basis of structural and legal deficiencies that have nothing to do with who I spent this evening speaking with. He let that land. They also deserve to know that you've spent tonight directing comments at Zuri Bennett that I heard from across this room, about her career, about her choices, about whether her life amounts to enough by your accounting. Vanessa opened her mouth. I've met a great many people, Min Jae said, who use other people's vulnerabilities as currency. I recognize the practice. I've had it directed at me. I understand exactly what you were attempting tonight and why it failed. A pause. What you're doing now, he said, is not courage. It's the last move available to someone who has run out of better ones. Vanessa Whitmore stood in her white dress under the amber light of the ballroom. She'd been the center of for 3 hours and looked at Kang Min Jae, and for the first time all evening, her face showed exactly what it felt. It was not attractive, and it was not graceful, and it was the most honest thing she'd done all night. Harrison stepped forward, put a hand on her arm. This time she didn't resist. They moved away. The room exhaled. And then in the reorganizing silence that followed, the murmurs beginning, the conversations restarting, the social machinery of 300 people processing what they'd just witnessed, Zuri heard something that stopped her completely. One of Min Jae's security men, at his shoulder, low, in Korean. And Min Jae's face, for the first time all evening, changed. That was the only word for it. The stillness that had characterized Min Jae all evening. The controlled, absolute stillness of a man who had decided long ago that showing nothing was safer than showing anything, cracked. Not dramatically, not in any way the rest of the room would have catalogued. But Zuri was close enough to see it, the slight tightening around the jaw, the way his eyes moved to his security man's face and then away, the almost imperceptible decision happening behind his expression. She stood up. "What is it?" she said. He looked at her. And what she saw in that look, brief, unguarded, gone in under a second, was the thing she hadn't expected from this man. Not the calculation she'd been watching all evening. Something raw, something that had arrived without his permission. "I have to go," he said. "Min-jae?" "Outside." He said it quietly, already moving. "There's a situation." "What kind of situation?" He stopped, turned back to her. The room was recovering around them, the murmurs of the Vanessa confrontation still cycling through the ballroom, and in the noise of that recovery he stood in front of Zuri Bennett and made a decision she could see him making. "Come with me," he said. "If you're willing. I'd rather you weren't alone in here." She picked up her clutch from the table. "What?" They moved through the ballroom with a speed that was nothing like his entrance. His security team consolidated around them. Not the loose perimeter of earlier, but a tighter formation, purposeful, 2 men ahead clearing the path and 2 behind maintaining it. Zuri kept pace at his right side, her heels finding the rhythm of the movement, her mind doing the rapid and unpleasant work of calculating what she'd walked into. In the corridor outside the ballroom, away from the music and the amber light, the hotel returned to its neutral self. Marble floors, wall sconces, the muted sound of other evenings happening in other parts of the building. A service elevator at the end of the corridor was already held open by a 5th man she hadn't seen before. They stepped in. The doors closed. In the compressed space of the elevator, Min-jae spoke to his security lead in Korean, low, fast, the cadence of a man issuing specific instructions to someone who already understood most of what needed to be said. The security lead responded with 2 short sentences. Min-jae looked at the ceiling for exactly 1 second, then back at the doors. "Tell me," Zuri said. He glanced at her. "A man named Seo Jun-ho," he said, "former director of operations for my organization. He was one of the men I mentioned, who chose different loyalties." "One of the coup?" "Yes." "You said it was addressed." "I said largely." A pause. "SEO was the exception. He disappeared 8 months ago. We believed he'd left the country." The elevator slowed. "He didn't." "He's here," Zuri said. "In Atlanta." "In this hotel," Min-jae said, "as of 20 minutes ago." The elevator opened onto a service corridor. Concrete floors, fluorescent lighting, the functional skeleton of the hotel hidden behind its public face. 2 black SUVs were visible through a propped loading dock door at the far end, engines running. Min-jae stopped, turned to her. "I need you to get in one of those cars," he said. "My driver will take you wherever you want to go. Home. Anywhere." She looked at him. "And you?" she said. "I have to deal with this." "Deal with it how?" He didn't answer immediately. His jaw was set. In the flat fluorescent light, he looked different than he had in the ballroom. The warmth of the amber uplighting replaced by something starker, the angles of his face harder, the controlled composure still present but visibly costing something to maintain. "Min-jae, nothing will happen tonight that should happen near you," he said. "That's all I can—" The sound came from behind them, from back up the service corridor, from a door that had not been there in their sightline 30 seconds ago and was now open. 3 men. Not his. The one in front was perhaps 50, compact, with the particular physical economy of someone who had spent decades in proximity to violence and developed a relationship with it that had nothing to do with excitement and everything to do with efficiency. He was wearing a gray suit that needed pressing and an expression that had been prepared in advance and delivered now with the flat precision of a rehearsed line. "Min-jae si," the man said. "Seo Jun-ho." Zuri knew it without being told. The way Min-jae's body changed, not flinching, nothing as simple as that, but the way a structure changes when you remove a load-bearing element and everything redistributes. Old knowledge, old weight. Min-jae's security moved. Fast. The two men behind them stepping forward and to the sides, creating a geometry, hands inside jackets. The two men from ahead of them were already turning, moving back. But Sio's men had done their own geometry. The second man had angled left toward the loading dock door. The third had stayed back by the open service door, blocking the return corridor. Not a fight yet, a shape that could become one. "You should have stayed gone," Min-jae said. Korean, but Zuri heard the sense of it in the register of his voice. Seo answered in Korean, longer, with the even delivery of someone explaining something they've already made peace with. Zuri watched Min-jae's face process it, the slight compression around his eyes, the moment of something that was not surprise because surprise would have required him to have expected better. "What is he saying?" she said quietly. Min-jae didn't answer immediately. Seo spoke again, and this time he looked at Zuri, directly, with the assessing look of a man noticing a variable he needs to account for. He said something short, something directed at Min-jae, and gestured toward Zuri with two fingers. Min-jae's voice, when he responded, had a temperature she hadn't heard from him before. Not loud, not theatrical. Cold in the way that certain things are cold, the kind that burns. She didn't need the translation. "He's using me," she said. "As what? Leverage?" Min-jae turned to look at her. The expression on his face was the most complicated thing she'd seen from him all evening. Anger and something that might have been anguish compressed into the narrow window of a man who did not do anguish publicly. "He's suggesting," Min-jae said, "that your presence tonight changes the nature of what I'm willing to do." "And does it?" A pause. "He believes it does," Min-jae said. She understood then the structure of what was happening. Seo Junho had spent 8 months watching, had identified the pattern of a man who had come to Atlanta for a specific and personal reason, had tracked the evening, had watched the ballroom, had waited for the moment when the variable was established. When it was clear that the woman at the table mattered, and then he'd moved, not to fight, to negotiate from a position that had been manufactured out of her presence. The fury that moved through her was clean and hot, and nothing like the tired hurt of the ballroom. This was different. This was the anger of being used as a tool by someone who had decided she was a feature of someone else's landscape rather than a person with her own center of gravity. She looked at Seo Junho. He looked back at her with the patience of a man who had correctly identified a mechanism and was waiting for it to operate. She took one step forward. Min-jae's hand caught her arm. "Don't." "He thinks I'm a pressure point," she said. "You are, right now." Low, urgent. "Zuri, he's wrong," she said. She looked at Min-jae. He was looking at her with the expression of a man watching something happen that he has no framework for. Not because it's threatening, but because it's completely outside the category of things he's learned to anticipate. "Tell him," she said, "that I'm not a negotiating position. Tell him I'm a witness." Min-jae was very still. "Tell him whatever he says in the next 5 minutes. I will remember with complete accuracy, and I have a phone in my clutch in 12 seconds to dial a number." A pause. "You're not..." Min-jae started. "I'm not scared," she said. "I am angry. There's a difference." She held his gaze. "Tell him." He looked at her for one more second with that unguarded look, the one that arrived without his permission, the one she'd first seen in the elevator, and then he turned back to Seo Junho and spoke. Whatever he said, it was brief. Seo's expression shifted, not rattled, recalculating. His eyes moved to Zuri again, reassessing. Zuri held his gaze without movement and without expression and let him look. Seo said something, short. Min-jae translated without inflection. "He says a woman with a phone is not a complication that concerns him." "Tell him I know who he is," Zuri said. "Tell him I've been watching him since he walked in. Tell him that a woman with a very good memory and an architecture firm that works extensively with city planners and development boards is a different kind of problem than the kind he's dealt with before." None of this was strategy. It was the raw conversion of fury into words, and she was letting it operate because there was nothing else available, and because she was damned if she was going to stand in a service corridor of a hotel in Buckhead and be a variable in someone else's calculation. Min-jae translated. Seo looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at his two men. Something passed between them. the fast, wordless communication of people who have worked together long enough to have a shared language of glances. The man by the loading dock door shifted his weight. The man by the service entrance checked something in his jacket that he decided, after a pause, to leave there. Seo spoke. Longer this time. Measured. Min-jae listened. He wants a meeting, Min-jae said. Tomorrow, proper terms, to discuss the conditions of a pause. A separation agreement. He came tonight to deliver that message, Zuri said. He came tonight, Min-jae said carefully, because he needed to assess whether my judgment had changed. Had it. Min-jae looked at her. That's what he needed to know. She held that. And, she said, and, Min-jae said, the fact that you're standing here tells him it has, in ways that might make me unpredictable. She understood. Seo had come to find whether the man he knew, the controlled, isolated, relationship-free man who could be manipulated only through organizational threats, still existed. And what he'd found instead was something he hadn't factored, something that created a new kind of unpredictability, not weakness, the opposite. A man with something personal to protect fought differently than a man who had only assets. Seo had wanted leverage. What he'd found was a complication he hadn't finished calculating yet. The meeting, Zuri said to Min-jae. He's genuine? He's practical, Min-jae said, which is close enough. She turned her eyes back to Seo. He met them, and in the unhurried, fluorescent-lit geometry of the service corridor, she understood that this was not a man who frightened easily and was not frightened now, but he was a man who had made a risk assessment and found the numbers changed. He spoke one more time, looked at Min-jae, then at Zuri, then away. He said something that sounded, even to her ears, like finality. His men moved first, back through the service door, smooth and practiced. Theo followed, pausing at the threshold for one last look at Min-jae that carried in it the entire weight of 12 years and a betrayal and whatever remained on the other side of it. Then he was gone. The door closed. The corridor was quiet except for the sound of the SUVs idling at the loading dock and the distant, muffled bass of the party continuing 2 floors above them, indifferent to all of it. Zuri became aware, in the aftermath of the adrenaline, that her heart was doing something unpleasant against her ribs. She kept her breathing even. Her hands, she noted with a distant satisfaction, were steady. Min-jae's security lead said something. Min-jae responded in Korean, then switched to English for her. We're clear. She nodded. He looked at her. In the flat corridor light, his face was open in a way the ballroom had only occasionally allowed, stripped of the performance, the controlled presentation, the layered management of how he appeared. What was under it was tired and specific and more human than anything she'd expected when he'd walked through that ballroom door. You didn't have to do that, he said. I know. That was... He stopped, appeared to weigh several words and find them insufficient. You didn't know what he'd do. Neither did you, she said. I had a better estimate. Maybe, she said, but I was angry. He looked at her for a long moment, and then something happened in his expression that she hadn't seen from him before and would spend a long time thinking about afterward. Something that wasn't managed and wasn't constructed and wasn't the careful deployment of a chosen response. It arrived on his face the way the hand at her waist had arrived, certain, without rehearsal, already decided before he knew it. I'm sorry, he said, that you were in that position. Don't be sorry, she said. I put myself there. I brought this here. You brought yourself here, she said. This came with you. That's different. He was quiet. From 2 floors above, through the concrete and the marble and the careful architecture of the hotel, she could still faintly hear the music, the reunion going on, the people who'd watched the evening's drama with the appetites of people for whom other people's lives were entertainment. She looked at the loading dock door, at the 2 black SUVs, engines still running, drivers behind the wheel, waiting. The meeting tomorrow, she said, with Seo. I'll handle it. I know you will. She looked at him. I'm asking if it ends it. He considered this with the seriousness it deserved, not reassurance, consideration. If the terms are what he suggested, he said, then yes. What remains after that is administrative, residual, nothing that comes to a hotel corridor. You're sure? Sure is a word for people with simpler problems, he said. But yes, close enough to sure. She held that, decided it was enough. Okay, she said. He looked at her. Okay, he said. Okay, she said again. He was still looking at her with the expression she'd identified and couldn't entirely name, the one that arrived without permission, when his security lead spoke again. Urgent. The cadence of someone delivering new information. The security lead's voice had the specific cadence of someone delivering a fact that had just changed the shape of the next hour. Clipped, certain, eyes moving between Min-jae and the loading dock door with the practiced efficiency of a man who had learned to present bad information without flinching. Min-jae absorbed it in 2 seconds, looked at the door, looked back. Seo didn't come alone, he said to Zuri. There are 2 more men at the hotel's front entrance, and 1 in the lobby. She processed this. He wasn't here to negotiate. He was here to assess, Min-jae said. The negotiation offer, that was contingent. On what? On whether I'd come down to this corridor, he said. Whether I'd move from a public space into a private one with a reduced security presence. He said it with the flat, factual tone of a man identifying an error in a structural calculation. Not self-recrimination, just the clean acknowledgement of a thing that had happened. I gave him the answer he came for. She understood the geometry instantly. Seo had needed to know if Min-jae was manageable, if the presence of a woman in his evening had softened the edges of his judgment enough to make him movable. The service corridor had been a test, and Min-jae had walked into it. Not because he was careless, because she'd been with him, and some part of the calculation that had always been purely tactical had, tonight, become something else. She watched him understand this about himself in real time, watched the recognition move through his expression and get absorbed without comment. What does he do now? She said. He has what he came for, Min-jae said, which means the negotiation is no longer from equal footing. He paused. He'll make contact tomorrow with revised terms. Worse terms. Significantly. She looked at the loading dock door, at the running SUVs, at his security lead watching the corridor behind them with the focused attention of someone listening for sounds that hadn't arrived yet. So go back upstairs, she said. Min-jae looked at her. Back to the ballroom, she said. 300 witnesses. Your security in the public room. He can't move on you there, and he knows it. That's why he pulled you down here. She met his eyes. Go back upstairs and make him wait until morning when you choose the location and the terms. A pause. His security lead said something in Korean. Min-jae responded without looking away from her. You understand tactical positioning, he said. I understand buildings, she said. Which rooms give you the advantage and which ones give it away. This corridor gives it away. She glanced at the concrete ceiling, the single exit behind them, the door Seo had walked through. Upstairs doesn't. He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face settled. Not relief exactly, but the quality of a decision being confirmed rather than made. Upstairs, he said to his security lead. They went back up. The ballroom received them the way a body receives a change in temperature. A general awareness, a subtle shift, without any single point of acknowledgement. The music was still going. The conversations had reorganized themselves after the Vanessa incident into something more energized. The way social events often become more alive after a disruption, feeding on the residual electricity. Zuri walked back to the table by the window. Min-jae followed. His security redistributed to the perimeter, back to the original formation, loose, visible, public. She sat down. He sat across from her. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Outside the window, Atlanta continued its indifferent, luminous business. The towers lit against the October sky, the highways moving, the city doing what cities do, which is continue regardless. You're very calm, he said. I'm not, she said. I'm just quiet about it. He looked at her. Your hands. She looked down. Her hands were pressed flat on the table again. She'd done this earlier, she realized, in the first conversation. The same gesture. The physical anchor she used when the internal weather required management. She lifted them, set them in her lap. I build things, she said. My whole career is understanding what holds and what doesn't, what you put weight on and what you don't. She paused. Tonight had a lot of structural problems. Yes, he said, including the fact that you walked into that corridor. He accepted this without deflection. Yes, because of me. Because of a choice I made, he said. The responsibility for a choice is with the person who makes it. I was the variable. You were the reason I wanted to move you somewhere safer, he said, which was Sio's read, and it was correct. But the choice to move was mine. She looked at him. Does that happen to you often? She said, making choices based on someone else's safety. He was quiet for a moment. No, he said, not in a long time. She held that. Across the room, she could see Ethan Caldwell at the bar with the posture of a man who had stopped drinking and started watching. He wasn't looking at her, so he was looking at his glass, at the bar, at the middle distance. But there was an attentiveness to him that she recognized as the attentiveness of someone engaged in a private reckoning. She'd thought about Ethan, on and off, for years, not with longing. That had resolved itself within the first 12 months after graduation, but with the specific unfinished quality of a question that had never received a direct answer. Why? Not why he'd chosen differently, she understood that. The mathematics of social ambition at 22 were not complicated. But why without a conversation? Why with the slow withdrawal of someone who hoped the wound would close before the other person noticed it had been made? She'd deserved a conversation. She'd never gotten one. She was looking at the bar when Ethan looked up and found her eyes. Across the noise and the distance of the room, they held the look for a moment. Two people who had once meant something specific to each other, regarding each other from the other side of 10 years. He raised his glass slightly. Not a toast, an acknowledgement. She nodded. That was all. That was, she understood in the receiving of it, enough. Not forgiveness. She wasn't interested in the performance of forgiveness, the formal absolution of someone who had never directly asked for it. But the recognition that they were both still standing, that 10 years had happened to both of them, and that what remained between them was not a wound but a scar, and scars were simply the body's record of what it had survived. She looked back at Min-jae. Tell me something true, she said. He looked at her. Something you haven't managed, she said. Something that isn't presentation. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might deflect. Then he put both hands on the table, mirroring her earlier gesture, she noted, and looked at the surface between them. I don't know how to do this, he said. She waited. I understand organizations, he said. I understand leverage and structure and the management of complicated systems. I have spent 20 years developing a particular kind of intelligence about how people operate and what they want and how to move within that. A pause. I don't know how to sit across from someone and want nothing from them except this. He looked up. The conversation. The fact of them being in the room. She heard the difficulty of it, not in the words, but in the specific quality of a man delivering information he had not intended to make available, the minor structural damage of honesty. That's what you had in Seoul, she said. I didn't know what it was, he said. I recognized it afterward. 40 minutes in the rain. 40 minutes in the rain, he said. She thought about her own version of that night. The closed storefront, the cold, the specific quality of talking to someone without agenda, without the professional calculus of what impression she was making or what the conversation was building toward. She'd been tired and hungry and far from home, and she'd sat on a concrete step and talked to a stranger like he was someone she'd known for years. She'd thought, walking back to the hotel, that it was one of those conversations that happen when circumstances remove all the usual barriers, travel, rain, closed doors, and create a temporary pocket of realness between people who will never see each other again. She'd been wrong about the last part. I thought you weren't going to answer my calls, she said, if you'd left a voicemail. I know. You should have left one anyway. I know that too, he said. I told myself the message would be wrong, that whatever I said would reduce it. He paused. So I said nothing and hoped eventually you'd answer. And when I didn't? Then I got on a plane, he said, simply. She looked at him for a long moment. The man who had entered this room, the controlled, formidable, carefully presented Kang Min-jae, who had rendered 300 people irrelevant by existing among them, was still present. She could see him, but she could also see the other version, the one who'd been sitting on a cold step outside a closed shop in the rain, holding a convenience store thermos with both hands, looking like a man who had forgotten what it was like to be looked at without calculation. Both of those were true. Both of those were him. She understood this, in the way she understood buildings, not despite their complications, but through them. The tension and compression that made a structure stand were not flaws in the design. They were the design. A building without stress was a building that hadn't been tested yet. "I have questions," she said, "about your world, about what you do and what that means, and what the shape of it looks like up close." She held his gaze. "I'm not going to pretend I don't." "I know," he said, "and I'm not—" She paused, organized herself. "I'm not someone who disappears into someone else's orbit. I have a firm. I have 12 people who show up because I built something worth showing up for. I have a city I'm designing pieces of, and that matters to me." "It should matter to you," he said. "I'm not going to set that down." "I'm not asking you to," he said. "I'm not interested in something you've set down." She felt the truth of that land, not as reassurance, as information, the specific piece of information that she'd been checking for, running the structural test without naming it as a test. "Okay," she said. "You keep saying that," he said. "Because I keep meaning it," she said. "Matt." At 11:47, Zuri Bennett picked up her clutch from the table by the window, stood up, and looked around the ballroom for what she knew would be the last time. It was still full. The party had found its second wind, the particular looseness of an event in its final hour when the performance pressure dropped, and people simply occupied the room. She could see Marcus Webb dancing badly and enjoying it. She could see Danielle Price deep in what looked like a real conversation with someone she'd been dismissive of earlier. She could see, near the bar, the cluster of people who would talk about this evening for months, who would construct and reconstruct the story of the man who'd walked through the door and what it meant and who the woman was and why she mattered. She didn't see Vanessa. She'd left, Zuri gathered, sometime after the confrontation with Min Jae. The white dress and the champagne flute and the arsenal of small cruelties, gone. The space where Vanessa Whitmore had stood all evening looked like what it was, a space. Ordinary, without the weight she'd spent years projecting into it. Zuri looked at it for a moment, then she turned away from it and walked toward the exit. Min Jae fell into step beside her without needing to be asked. The Atlanta night was warm for October. That particular southern warmth that stayed after sunset, thick and full of the smell of coming rain. The hotel's circular drive was lit with the amber wash of carriage lights, and 3 armored black vehicles waited at the curb with engines running and drivers already positioned. They stood at the top of the entrance steps. The city stretched south and east from where they stood. The skyline familiar to her in the way the inside of her own hand was familiar. The buildings she knew by name and by the stories of the people who'd built them. The buildings she'd added to, and 3, now 3, that bore her decisions in their bones. 13 hours, she said. He glanced at her. "On the plane," she said. "You said 13 hours. Rehearsing what to say." "I did." "What were you going to say?" He was quiet for a moment. The October warmth moved around them. Somewhere on the drive, one of the drivers shifted in his seat. "I had an introduction prepared," he said. "That acknowledged the circumstances and didn't overclaim. Something that explained how I found you without making it sound like what it sounds like." A slight pause. "I had a second option that was more direct. Fewer words. Harder to miscalibrate." He looked at her. "Neither of them survived the moment I saw you across the room." "What happened?" "I saw you," he said, "and everything I'd prepared became—" He paused. "Insufficient." He looked at the city. "All I could think was that you were there, that I'd found you, and everything else was after." She felt something move through her chest. Not the clean heat of earlier, not the cold of the service corridor, but something that had its own temperature, warmer than either. "There you are," she said. He looked at her. "That's what you said," she said, "when you walked up." "Yes, that's all you had." "That's all I had," he said. She looked at the city, at the buildings she knew and the ones she didn't yet, at the lights that were someone's office and someone's home and someone's all-night argument with a person they loved. The city as a system of choices made by people who had to live inside them. "The CO meeting," she said. "Tomorrow. Handled, he said. On my terms. A location I choose, morning hours, full presence. He'll come because the alternative costs him more. A pause. It will take most of the day. And after? After is... He seemed to consider the word. Available. She turned to look at him. I'm not going to tell you it's simple, he said. My world is... It has edges. Some of them are sharp. I've spent 20 years building it, and there are consequences to that kind of building that don't disappear because you want them to. He held her gaze. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. I don't want pretending, she said. I know. I want what I had in Seoul, she said. The real conversation, whatever that means from here. That's what I came for, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. In the carriage light, he looked like both things simultaneously. The man who could walk into a ballroom and reorganize its social physics without effort, and the man who had sat on a cold step with a thermos and received a cup of hotel coffee from a tired stranger like it was something that mattered. Both were true. Both were him. She had always known how to read a structure, how to see the forces operating within it, the stress and the load and the choices built into the foundation. She knew that what she was looking at was complicated. That complicated was not the same as unsound. She stepped down one step, turned back to him. Come on then, she said. He looked at her. You've been standing outside my life for 10 months, she said. You may as well come inside. Something moved across his face. Swift, unmanaged, genuine. Not the smile of a man performing warmth. The expression of a man who has held something carefully for a long time and has just been told he can put it down. He came down the steps. They rode in the back of the lead vehicle through the Atlanta night, the convoy of 3 moving south along the corridor she'd watched from the Uber 2 hours ago, the construction cranes dark now, the city in its post-midnight register, quieter, more honest, the daylight performance dissolved and the real city visible underneath. She didn't talk much. Neither did he. There was something in the quality of the silence, not the silence of 2 people who had nothing to say, but the silence of 2 people who had said enough for one night and could afford to stop. She watched the city move past the tinted window and felt the accumulated weight of the evening begin, by degrees, to release. The ballroom. Vanessa's smile and what was underneath it. Ethan at the bar with his glass raised in the acknowledgement of 10 years and everything they hadn't been. The service corridor and the fluorescent light and Seo Junho's calculating eyes. The feel of the cold marble under her palms in the hotel bathroom when she'd told herself she wasn't going to fall apart. She hadn't fallen apart. She thought about this without pride and without relief, just the clean, factual recognition of a thing that had happened. She had walked into a room that had spent 10 years holding a version of her she'd outgrown, and she had walked back out of it herself, with every scar showing and both hands steady. That was not nothing. Beside her, Min-jae sat with the particular stillness she'd been reading all evening, but it had changed quality, softer at the edges, less managed. His hands rested on his knees and he was looking at the city moving past his window, and there was something on his face that she thought might be the expression a man wears when he's arrived somewhere he wasn't certain he'd reach. Can I ask you something? She said. He looked at her. That night in Seoul, she said, when you were sitting there, before I showed up. He waited. What were you thinking about? A pause. Long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he looked back at the city and said quietly, whether any of it was worth the cost. She let that sit between them. Your organization, she said. Everything, he said. The organization, the 20 years, the choices that built it, and the choices that protected it, and the choices that... He stopped. The particular way a person becomes unrecognizable to themselves when they've spent long enough operating in a world that rewards a specific kind of ruthlessness. He paused. I was sitting there trying to remember what I'd wanted before I wanted any of that. What did you want? He was quiet. To build something, he said. That's what I remember. Something that mattered. Something that lasted. She looked at him. You built something. I built something, he agreed. The question I was sitting with was whether it was the thing I'd meant. She understood this. Not from his world, from hers. The years of her career that she'd spent building toward a version of professional success that looked right from the outside and felt, in the quiet of her apartment at 2 in the morning, like a room she'd furnished for someone else. The reunion she'd dreaded because some part of her still calibrated her worth against the measurements of people who had never seen her clearly. She'd been sitting in her own version of that closed storefront for years. "You asked me for nothing," he said, "that night. You just—" He paused. "Talked to me, like I was a person in the rain who needed somewhere to stand out of the cold." "You were," she said. "That's what I mean," he said. The convoy moved south. The city opened up around them, the dense midtown core giving way to neighborhoods. The neighborhoods to the wider Atlanta sprawl, amber streetlights marking the intervals of blocks she'd walked and driven and thought about in terms of setbacks and grades and what a building needed from the ground it stood on. She didn't ask where they were going. She'd given the driver her address when she got in. That was enough architecture for one night. A destination, a route, the reasonable confidence that the road between them was navigable. They pulled up outside her building at 12:23. The driver came around. She stepped out onto the sidewalk. Min-jae followed. They stood on the pavement outside her building, and the convoy idled behind them, and the neighborhood was quiet in the way Atlanta gets quiet after midnight. Not dead, just private. The city having its own conversation in a lower register. "Tomorrow," she said. "After the meeting." "After the meeting," he said. "Call me. This time leave a message if I don't answer." He looked at her. "What should the message say?" "Something true," she said. "You're apparently good at that when you're not rehearsing." Something moved in his expression again. That unmanaged thing. She was getting better at reading it. It was the face of a man who had spent a very long time being difficult to reach, and had, over the course of one Atlanta evening, been reached anyway. "Good night, Zuri," he said. "Good night," she said. She turned and walked to her building entrance. At the door she stopped, not because she needed to, but because she wanted to, and looked back. He was still standing on the pavement, not watching her with the performance of significance, not constructing a moment, just standing there in the October warmth, with the city behind him and the idling convoy at his back, with the expression of a man who has found something he'd stopped believing was findable. She held the look for a moment. Then she went inside. Brutus was on the kitchen counter when she came in, performing the elaborate indifference of a cat who had been waiting for 2 hours and intended not to acknowledge it. She set her clutch on the counter and scratched behind his ears, and he endured it with dignity. She took off her heels, set them by the door. She stood in her kitchen in her burgundy dress in the quiet of her apartment and thought about the building she was designing for the mixed-use development on the west side, the one she'd been stuck on for 6 weeks, the east facade that wasn't resolving right, the ratio of glass to concrete that kept landing wrong. She'd been approaching it from the wrong angle. She understood this now, standing in her kitchen at 12:30 in the morning, with the accumulated weight and heat and noise of the evening metabolizing in her bloodstream. The problem wasn't the facade. The problem was what she was asking the facade to do, to carry visual weight that should be distributed differently, to compensate for a structural decision made 3 months ago that wasn't serving the building. She needed to go back to the decision, not the symptom. She'd been doing that in other areas too, she thought, compensating at the surface for things that needed to be addressed in the structure. She reached for a glass of water. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. An unknown international number. No call. A text message. She opened it. The 13 hours. I should not have wasted them on speeches. I should have spent them remembering what I actually wanted to say. What I actually wanted to say is that 40 minutes in the rain was the clearest I had felt in years. I wanted you to know that. Good night. She read it twice. Then she set her phone face down on the counter and leaned her back against the kitchen cabinets and looked at the ceiling of her apartment, the ceiling she'd stared at on 100 difficult nights, that she knew by heart, that had no particular architectural merit but was hers. She breathed. The reunion was behind her, the ballroom with its amber light and its social machinery and its decade of accumulated weight behind her. Vanessa Whitmore, who had spent 10 years using Zuri as a mirror to confirm her own reflection, had lost the mirror tonight and would have to find another way to see herself. Ethan Caldwell, who had made a young woman feel like a liability, had raised his glass across a room and closed a chapter that neither of them had known how to close. And Kang Min-jae, who had come 13 hours through the air for a 40-minute conversation in the rain, was somewhere in the Atlanta night in an armored car, Going back to a hotel room where tomorrow he would sit across a table from the man who had tried to take everything from him and negotiate the terms of what remained. She thought about all of it, held it without trying to resolve it. Then she pushed off the counter, walked to her desk, opened her laptop, and pulled up the east facade drawings. She worked for an hour, made 3 decisions she'd been avoiding for 6 weeks, fixed the things she'd been compensating for at the surface by going back to the structure. When she finally went to bed, she slept without difficulty and without dreams, the deep, uncomplicated sleep of a person who has put down something heavy and not yet decided what to pick up next. The city continued outside her window. The buildings she'd designed stood in it, solid in particular and hers, holding the weight they'd been built to hold. She had not walked out of the reunion with answers. She had walked out with something more useful, the clear-eyed knowledge of what she was done carrying, and the first real sense, provisional, unguaranteed, worth the risk, of what she might be willing to pick up instead. That was enough to start with. That was, she thought, exactly enough.